In the spring of 1912, Arthur John Priest was a 25-year-old man from Southampton, a life shaped by the rhythm of the docks and the might of the sea. He was a stoker, known in the maritime world as a fireman. His was not a glamorous life on the decks where passengers enjoyed the ocean breeze. It was a life spent in the very belly of the ship, in the sweltering, deafening heat of the boiler rooms. His world was one of grit and muscle, defined by the relentless swing of a shovel, feeding tons of coal into the insatiable furnaces that powered the great liners. This back-breaking labor was the engine of the golden age of ocean travel, and men like Arthur Priest were its anonymous, indispensable heart. When he signed on to the RMS Titanic for its maiden voyage, it was simply another job, another vessel in a career spent deep within the steel hulls of passenger ships. The legendary luxury of the Titanic, the grand staircases and opulent staterooms, existed in a universe far removed from his own. His domain was a stark contrast, a cavernous, coal-dusted hellscape, illuminated by the furious glow of the fires, where the air was thick with heat and the fine black particles that would have coated his lungs and skin. He was part of a small army of stokers working around the clock in shifts, and his survival would depend on the brutal physical endurance this job had forged in him. On the night of April 14th, Arthur Priest was, by a twist of fate, off duty and asleep in his quarters. The shuddering impact of the iceberg against the ship's hull was the sound that shattered his world. The ensuing chaos in the labyrinthine crew areas deep within the ship would have been a particular kind of terror. While first-class passengers were initially met with calm reassurances, the stokers and engineers knew the grave language of a wounded ship. They understood the sound of rushing water where it shouldn't be, the alarming list of the deck beneath their feet. Priest made his way to the open air, escaping the confines of the sinking giant to a scene of unfolding horror on the outer decks. He was ultimately ordered into Lifeboat 15, one of the last to be launched, and from the freezing safety of that small craft, he watched the unthinkable happen. The unsinkable ship, the very symbol of human ambition, broke apart and vanished into the black waters, leaving him and the other survivors adrift in the silent, star-filled night, surrounded by the echoes of those who were lost. The night of April 14, 1912, began in a rare moment of rest for Arthur Priest. Off duty and asleep in his bunk deep within the ship's forward section, he was jolted awake not by a loud crash, but by a strange grinding shudder that rippled through the very frame of the vessel. For a seasoned stoker, in tune with the rhythms and sounds of a ship at sea, this was immediately and terrifyingly wrong. The normal, steady hum of the engine ceased, replaced by an eerie quiet that was more alarming than any noise. The initial confusion among the crew quickly gave way to a grim understanding as orders were barked and men began to scramble. Priest, pulling on his clothes, would have felt the already faint list of the deck grow more pronounced beneath his feet as he made his way up from the crew quarters. The journey to the boat deck was a climb from a familiar, if harsh, workplace into a scene of escalating surrealism. He emerged into the cold, crisp air to find a world of confusion. The decks were gradually filling with passengers, many in their nightclothes, some curious, others apprehensive, but few yet grasping the mortal danger they were in. The initial calm was punctuated by the sharp cracks of distress rockets being fired into the still, starry sky, their white blossoms illuminating the terrifying truth in brief, brilliant flashes. As a member of the crew, Priest would have been directed to assist, likely helping with the tedious and chaotic process of loading the lifeboats. The crew's training had been minimal, and the women and children first protocol was applied with chaotic inconsistency. The palpable fear grew as the ship's tilt became undeniable, the bow dipping ever lower, dragging the great liner's stern slowly and ominously out of the water. The air began to fill with the sound of panic, shouts, cries, and the desperate strains of the ship's band, which played on in a valiant attempt to maintain order. It was in this maelstrom of fear and futility that Arthur Priest found his own chance at survival. He was ordered into Lifeboat 15, which was being launched from the starboard side. The descent down the side of the towering ship was a harrowing journey into darkness, the black, frigid water 70 feet below. From the relative safety of the lifeboat, the scene transformed into a grand, horrific spectacle. The Titanic, a mountain of light against the night, was now visibly dying. Its lights flickered, went out, and then came on one last time with a final gasping surge of power before utter blackness. The silence that followed was broken by a roar, the sound of everything inside the ship breaking loose, followed by the tremendous groans and reports of the ship's structure succumbing to unimaginable stresses. Then came the final act, the stern rising nearly vertical against the sky, a colossal black silhouette blotting out the stars, hanging for a terrifying moment before sliding, with a final, thundering rush beneath the calm surface of the ocean. The night was then returned to an unnatural quiet, broken only by the lapping of waves and a sound that would haunt every survivor until their dying day: the desperate, fading cries of over 1,000 people freezing to death in the water. The silence that settled over the North Atlantic after the Titanic disappeared was a void filled with a profound and chilling horror. For Arthur Priest and the other survivors huddled in Lifeboat 15, the immediate aftermath was a battle against the cold and a psychological torment few could comprehend. Huddled together for warmth, they drifted in the darkness, surrounded by the evidence of the catastrophe. The initial cacophony of screams from those in the water, which one survivor described as a sound like a great stadium of people cheering, slowly, agonizingly, faded away into an utter and devastating silence over the course of an hour. This transition from chaos to quiet was perhaps more traumatic than the sinking itself, a stark and brutal confirmation of the scale of the loss. When the lights of the RMS Carpathia appeared on the horizon near 4 in the morning, it was a sight of salvation, but the journey to safety was a slow and grim process. As dawn broke, it revealed a heartbreaking scene, a calm, flat ocean littered with debris, wooden splinters, deck chairs, and other flotsam, the only grave markers for the vast majority of the victims. Pulled aboard the Carpathia, Priest was safe, but he was now a survivor, a label that carried its own heavy burden. Wrapped in a blanket, shivering not just from the cold but from shock, he was one of hundreds of shell-shocked souls who had witnessed the unthinkable. The week-long journey to New York was a somber, floating wake. The survivors were cared for with immense compassion, but they were trapped with their shared, unspeakable memories. The world awaited their arrival, and upon reaching New York, they were immediately thrust into a media storm. Priest, a lowly stoker, would have found himself questioned and his story sought, his personal trauma becoming public property. He returned to England, not as the man he was, but as a relic of one of history's greatest peacetime disasters. The experience undoubtedly left deep, invisible scars. The cold of the Atlantic, the sounds of the dying, and the image of the great ship's final moments were memories etched permanently into his mind. He had faced a monster of an accident and lived. He must have believed, with every fiber of his being, that he had used a lifetime's worth of luck in one night, that he had endured a horror so singular and immense that the fates could demand nothing more of him. He was, as we know, tragically and incredibly wrong. The sea was not yet finished with Arthur John Priest. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 reshaped the world, and for men like Arthur Priest, the sea remained his workplace, though its perils were now magnified by the machinery of modern conflict. He continued his service in the merchant navy, his skills as a stoker still in high demand to power the vessels that were now the lifelines of the British war effort. His path, in a twist of fate that seems almost fictional, led him back to the very shipyard that had built his former nemesis. He found himself once again deep in the boiler room of a colossal Olympic-class liner, the HMHS Britannic. As the sister ship to the Titanic, the Britannic was a near-identical giant, but her purpose had been dramatically transformed. Where the Titanic was a symbol of luxury, the Britannic was now painted in brilliant white with large red crosses, a hospital ship dedicated to carrying wounded soldiers from the battlefields of the Mediterranean. For Priest, this must have been a profoundly unsettling assignment. To walk the same kind of corridors, to feel the familiar vibration of a nearly identical engine, to shovel coal into furnaces of a sister to the ship that haunted his dreams, it was a constant, physical reminder of his past trauma. Yet, life went on, and the war demanded its service. On the morning of November 21, 1916, the Britannic was cutting a clear path through the calm waters of the Aegean Sea near the Greek island of Kea. Without warning, a tremendous explosion tore through the ship's hull. The cause was a German naval mine, a hidden, impersonal weapon that struck with devastating force. The initial shock and the violent list of the ship would have been a terrifyingly familiar sensation for Priest, a dreadful echo of that night 4 years prior. The same nightmare was beginning again, but this time, the context was different. This was not an accident born of overconfidence in nature. This was a deliberate act of war, and the ship was filled not with civilian passengers, but with medical staff and crew a fact that did not shield it from disaster. The sinking of the Britannic unfolded with a terrifying swiftness that made the Titanic's 2-hour-long demise seem almost gradual. The mine had struck a critical spot, and compounded by open portholes and possibly a faulty watertight door, the massive ship began to capsize rapidly. The crew, many of whom were Titanic veterans, launched into well-drilled evacuation procedures, but the ship's accelerating list made launching lifeboats a deadly challenge. Several boats were launched prematurely and were sucked into the churning, still-spinning propellers of the sinking ship, which were now rising out of the water, chewing the lifeboats and their occupants to splinters. It was into this chaos that Arthur Priest was thrown. He would have had to navigate a world tilting at an impossible angle, scrambling up slick, sloping decks to find a way off the doomed vessel. At some point, he ended up in the water, fighting for his life amidst the debris and the panicked swimmers. It was here that he faced a danger even more immediate than drowning or hypothermia. The colossal bronze propellers of the Britannic, emerging from the sea like monstrous, spinning blades, created a powerful vortex, sucking in everything around them: water, wreckage, and people. Priest found himself caught in this deadly pull, fighting against the current that was dragging him towards a certain and gruesome death. In what must have felt like a superhuman effort, he managed to escape the suction, likely by swimming desperately sideways or finding a piece of flotsam to cling to, watching in horror as others were not so fortunate. The Britannic vanished beneath the waves in a mere 55 minutes, a fraction of the time it took the Titanic to sink. When rescue arrived, Arthur John Priest was once again pulled from the water, alive. Of the 1,066 people on board, 1,036 were saved, but 30 perished, many in the horrific propeller incident. To have survived the Titanic was considered a miracle. To have now survived the sinking of its sister ship, under the violent circumstances of war, was beyond statistical probability. He was no longer just a Titanic survivor. He was a man marked by the sea, a living legend who had now cheated death in two of the most famous maritime disasters in history. The nickname, the Unsinkable Stoker, was no longer just a curious moniker. It was beginning to sound like a challenge thrown down to fate itself. If any man had earned a reprieve from the perils of the sea, it was Arthur Priest. Yet, the relentless machinery of war and his own profession offered no such respite. Merely months after his harrowing escape from the Britannic in the spring of 1917, he was back at his post, this time aboard the HMHS Donegal, a converted passenger steamer serving, like the Britannic, as a hospital ship. The English Channel, a vital but fiercely contested artery of the war, was a hunting ground for German U-boats, and the Donegal, despite its clear markings, was not immune to the threat. On April 17th, without warning, a torpedo fired from the submarine U-64 found its mark. The violent explosion tore through the ship, and the familiar, dreadful sequence began anew. The shuddering impact, the sudden list, the scramble for lifeboats. For the third time, Priest found himself abandoning a vessel destined for the seabed. The cold Channel waters claimed 41 lives that day, but once again, against the grim arithmetic of naval warfare, Arthur Priest was counted among the survivors. His luck, if it could be called that, seemed to be a force of nature in itself, a bizarre and terrifying inverse of the curse that appeared to follow him. This pattern of survival reached an almost absurd climax later that same year when Priest was serving aboard the HMS Alcantara, an armed merchant cruiser. This was not a passive hospital ship but a warship actively tasked with hunting enemy commerce raiders. On February 29, 1916, the Alcantara had engaged the German raider SMS Gräfin, a ship disguised as a neutral merchant vessel until it revealed its true nature at point-blank range. What ensued was not a slow death by mine or torpedo, but a close-quarters, furious naval gun battle. Shells tore through both ships, inflicting catastrophic damage in a brutal exchange of fire. This was a new kind of terror for Priest, not the silent, creeping doom of a mine strike or the sudden lurch of a torpedo impact, but the deafening roar of artillery, the scream of incoming shells, and the concussive blasts of direct hits. In this hellish engagement, both vessels proved mortally wounded. The Alcantara, ravaged by the fight, joined the growing list of ships beneath the waves, and the Gräfin soon followed. For the fourth time in 5 years, Arthur Priest was cast into the ocean, this time amidst the oil-slicked debris of a naval battle. And for the fourth time, against all conceivable odds, he was rescued from the water, a living testament to a resilience that defied any logical explanation. He had now survived a catastrophic accident, a mine strike, a torpedo attack, and a full-blown surface battle. The sheer accumulation of these disasters transformed Arthur John Priest from a mere survivor into a maritime myth. 4 ships. 4 catastrophic sinkings in just 5 years. It was a record of misfortune so profound it looped back into a kind of legendary fortune. Among his fellow sailors and stokers, who were by nature a superstitious breed, his name became a byword for the impossible. To serve on a ship with Arthur Priest was to know, with a chilling certainty, that the vessel was destined for a tragic end, yet his continued survival also offered a strange, paradoxical comfort. He was a rabbit's foot and a harbinger of doom rolled into one. The press, always eager for a compelling human story amidst the grim tally of war casualties, quickly latched onto him. They needed a hook, a name that could capture the public's imagination, and they found it in the moniker bestowed upon him by the men who toiled alongside him in the boiler rooms, the Unsinkable Stoker. This title was not merely a description of his experiences. It was a title born of awe, respect, and more than a little bit of superstition. It spoke to a quality that seemed to transcend mere luck. It suggested a man who possessed an almost supernatural ability to defy the sea's most determined claims. In an era where thousands of sailors were lost to the deep, his repeated escapes felt like a direct challenge to the natural order. He had looked into the abyss on 4 separate, monumental occasions and had each time returned to tell the tale, or more accurately, to quietly endure the telling of it by others. The legend of the Unsinkable Stoker served as a powerful, if peculiar, symbol of hope, proof that even in the face of the most overwhelming odds, the human spirit, or perhaps just one indestructible man, could somehow endure. His life was no longer just his own. It had become a story, a piece of folklore that would forever be entwined with the most famous maritime disaster in history and the brutal naval conflict that followed. With the end of the First World War, the great engines of the ships that had defined his life fell silent, and Arthur John Priest finally, and one can assume with immense finality, turned his back on the sea. He stepped ashore for the last time, a man who had cheated death on a scale that remains unparalleled in recorded maritime history. The world he returned to was one forever scarred by war, but for him the battle had been a deeply personal one, fought not in the trenches of the Western Front, but in the freezing waters of the Atlantic, the Aegean, and the English Channel. He carried with him no medals for his survival, only the invisible, profound scars of his experiences. The transition to life on land was a journey into a different kind of anonymity. He sought no fame from his incredible story. In fact, he seemed to actively avoid it. The man who had lived through the most sensational headlines settled into the quiet, predictable rhythms of a shore-based existence. He found work as a hotel porter and later as a night watchman, roles that stood in stark contrast to the roaring, fiery chaos of the stoker's hole. These were jobs of quiet service and solitude, requiring patience and vigilance of a different sort. One can imagine the thoughts that must have crossed his mind during the long silent hours of a night watch, the stark contrast between the biting cold of a North Atlantic night and the still air of a warehouse, the memory of a ship's deafening siren compared to the quiet ticking of a clock. He became a figure of quiet routine, known to his neighbors and colleagues not as the Unsinkable Stoker, but simply as Arthur Priest, a reliable and unassuming man. He rarely, if ever, spoke of his past. The stories were too vast, too unbelievable, and too painful. How could one casually mention over tea that they had not only been on the Titanic, but on 3 other ships that had met similarly grim fates? His silence was a fortress, a way of building a normal life upon a foundation of the most abnormal trauma. He had witnessed the extremes of human panic, heroism, and loss, and in his later years, he seemed to choose the profound peace of obscurity, a hard-earned right after a life spent at the very edge of human endurance. The final chapter of Arthur John Priest's life carries a profound and poignant irony that seems almost crafted by fate itself. This was a man who had faced down the most dramatic and violent ends the modern world could conjure. He had defied the icy, suffocating grasp of the Atlantic, the hidden, explosive power of a naval mine, the sudden, murderous strike of a torpedo, and the shredding shrapnel of a full-scale naval battle. The sea, in all its fury and with all the technological enhancements of war, had thrown its worst at him, and it had consistently failed to claim him. He was a man who, by all accounts, should have died a hero's death at sea a dozen times over. Yet, His end came not in a dramatic blast or in the deep, dark water, but in the quiet, ordinary confines of his own home. In 1937, at the age of just 51, Arthur Priest succumbed to pneumonia, a common and yet, in his time, often deadly illness. After a lifetime of surviving the colossal and the catastrophic, it was a microscopic organism, a simple and mundane affliction, that finally stilled his indomitable heart. There is a deep, almost poetic resonance in this conclusion. The very elements that had failed to kill him, the water, the cold, the violence, were, in a way, avenged by a sickness that attacks the lungs, the very breath of life. It serves as a humbling reminder that for all our epic struggles against visible foes, we remain fragile in the face of nature's smallest and most indifferent forces. His peaceful passing in his bed in Southampton, the port city that had been the beginning and end of so many of his fateful journeys, was the final, quiet twist in his unbelievable narrative. The sea, which had been his workplace, his battlefield, and his tormentor, was ultimately denied its prize. Arthur John Priest, the unsinkable stoker, was ultimately felled not by a force of the deep, but by a whisper of the air.